October 18th, 1943, northern Italy. American B-29 bombers were preparing to strike a mountain village believed to be held by German forces with Panthers dug in for defense. In the rough mount terrain, radios failed and enemy intercepts made every signal risky. Engines roared, bombs were armed, the order was clear: totally destroy the target. Then, just before bombing, a Pigeon landed at the airfield, with name Joe, U.S. Army Signal Corps. The message on his leg read, "Calvi Vecchia secured, 56th, London Division in possession. Cancel airstrike immediately." Within minutes, the mission was aborted. More than 1,000 British soldiers were spared, saved by one small bird. Why were Allies pilots and soldiers betting lives on birds? Because the German intelligence could jam, triangulate, or trick a radio. They could never intercept a homing instinct. RAF fighters and bombers carried Pigeons in watertight bakelite containers, stowed behind armor or seat rails, standard equipment, like a flare pistol. If a Spitfire fighter ditched or a Blenheim set went dead, the crew wrote coordinates, wind, and fuel on a message slip, slipped it into the tiny canister, and let the bird go. The loft at base was the one node the Germans couldn't listen to. No call signs, no cipher settings to crack, no broadcast to DF, just wings. And it worked with a ruthlessness that embarrassed sophisticated kit. In February 1942, an RAF Beaufort struggling home from a strike in the North Sea lost power and ditched in winter water. No radio, no flares left. The crew freed their Pigeon, Winkie, and watched her vanish into sleet. The heroic bird hit her loft in Scotland hours later, coated in oil, exhausted, with no message. The controllers took her arrival time, the wind, drift, and the last known vector, drew bearings on a chart, and put rescue boats on the right patch of ocean. They pulled the crew out alive. No transmission for a U-boat to hear. No beacon for a Ju-88 to home on. Just a bird and a slide rule. Pilots joked about feathered wireless, but the joke stopped when it saved friends. Ground crews learned loft numbers by heart. Squadron Pigeon handlers were as fussy as instrument fitters. The containers were greased and gasketed, the message tubes tied with idiot-proof cords. Pigeons were fed to a schedule, trained on forced routes, acclimated to engine noise and cordite stink. Aircrew learned to write short, grid course souls aboard, state of play, and to attach 2 copies on 2 birds when the weather went evil. If your set fried or your mast snapped, you still had a line home strapped behind your seat. G.I. Joe's sprint at Calvi Vecchia wasn't a miracle. It was doctrine. Quiet, unfashionable, low-tech doctrine that treated a living compass as the most reliable comms gear on the battlefield. Radios could be fooled. Wires could be cut. A homing Pigeon, trained hard and released in time, could cut through jamming, weather, and chaos, sometimes fast enough to stop a 1,000-bomb mistake in its tracks. By habit and necessity, RAF crews learned to treat Pigeons like another vital instrument, needle and compass, not a pet. The National Pigeon Service and the Army's Pigeon sections ran dozens of lofts across Britain, each with a numeric call sign pilots memorized along with emergency frequencies. At big bases, West Hampnet, Coltishall, Tangmere, there were dedicated Pigeon lofts and handlers on 24-hour standby. A spare cage, a sealed message capsule, a tube of grease for the cap. These were routine as spark plugs. Pilots kept birds in watertight bakelite tubes bolted into the fuselage, or in small wooden boxes padded with straw. Spitfires, Hurricanes, Beaufighters, and even light bombers carried them folded and fastened so they survived a high G turn. If the radio died, if the set was smashed by flak, if the navigator's star compasses and maps were gone, the last resort was the little cone and a folded message. The slip contained a grid reference, wind, altitude, number of survivors, and, when possible, a sketch of the coastline or nearest landmark. If rescue depended on speed, crews trained to attach 2 identical slips to 2 pigeons and release both. Redundancy was cheap. That redundancy mattered because pigeons returned under conditions no transistor could survive. Winkie, for example, left the frigid North Sea after a Bristol Beaufort ditched in 1942 and found her way back to RAF Dice in Scotland, despite oil on her plumage and gale force winds. Her arrival gave controllers the time and bearing to vector launches and lifeboats into a tiny patch of ocean where the crew bobbed. No radio, no homing beacon, nothing but a feathered courier. Winkie lived to fly again. G.I. Joe's run to Capua was only the most dramatic of many. The pattern repeated across theaters. A force captures a village. Higher headquarters has outdated intel. Aircraft are armed and ready to make the strike. A keyed note, a pigeon, and minutes later, the air plan changes. In Operation Market Garden, where radio chaos and terrain problems compounded every hour, reports, some authenticated, some exaggerated, tell of pigeons carrying last-minute status updates from besieged positions. The bird named William of Orange, according to accounts circulating in airborne messes, carried word of a breakout route and helped coordinate an evacuation that saved roughly 2,000 troops trapped in a pocket when wireless silence and German jamming severed command lines. The mechanics were straightforward. Pigeons were fast enough to outrun any intercept and silent enough to bypass enemy direction finding. A message slipped into a tube and clipped to a bird told HQ what no cipher could in time. Pigeons also provided a counterintelligence advantage. Radio transmissions could be intercepted. German radio operators could detect patterns, triangulate positions, and use decoys. A flying message belonged to no frequency band, no wavelength, and could not be mimicked unless the enemy stole and trained birds. Hard to do across occupied front lines. Resistance networks used pigeons extensively. Mary of Exeter, one of the Resistance's frequently cited names, carried multiple messages through occupied France, sometimes injured, sometimes shot at, but always home. Her arrivals let handlers validate drop zones and update SOE planners without the delay or compromise that came with couriers crossing roads and checkpoints. Handlers were obsessive. The loftkeeper's rituals mattered. Rotate training routes so birds learned to home from enemy-held areas. Feed and water schedules, timed to flights. Short-range releases to keep muscle tone, long route training to reinforce the bearing home. Birds were stamped and cataloged the way engines were logged. A good loftman could tell you which bird would perform when the wind was east, which would fail if the mercury dropped below freezing. Crews learned to write fast and compact. 6 words that meant the difference between a pickup and a funeral. Location, condition, wounded, survivors, fuel, and urgency. Pigeons didn't replace radios. They complemented them. They were a quiet guarantee in a noisy, hackable system. On D-Day and after, when airborne and seaborne operations created electromagnetic clutter, lofts and pigeon slips acted like a human-scale, low-tech mesh network. Several thousand pigeons were on active service during the war in Britain alone. Across the Allied forces, the total ran into the tens of thousands. Each bird was small insurance against technological failure, and they were stubbornly heroic. Pilots told the same story over and over. After ditching in foam and oil, with chill and shock closing in, a man could still watch a blur head for the horizon and believe. That belief mattered. Aircraft were complex, radios were brittle, and the Germans had ears everywhere. A pigeon could not be DF'd, could not be decoded, and could not betray secrets by mistake. It simply flew home, and sometimes it flew home in time to change history. February 1942, North Sea. The bomber is a Bristol Beaufort from Coastal Command, tailcode WWII, on its way back from a strike against German shipping near Stavanger. The port engine is gone, starboard coughing smoke, the cockpit gauges dead. The radio operator keeps hammering his transmitter key, but it's useless. Antenna torn away by shrapnel. Power fluctuating with every lurch of the dying plane. Below them, just freezing gray water and miles of nowhere. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant George Ross, makes the only call left. Prepare to ditch. The crew braces. The Beaufort hits the water hard, breaks in two. Ross and 3 others crawl onto a leaking dinghy, battered, soaked, bleeding. The cold starts doing its work within minutes. They have no flares, no working wireless, no visible land. The Beaufort will sink before anyone knows where they went down, unless something flies home for them. Ross opens a small green box bolted to the fuselage section that's still floating beside them. Inside, shivering and slick with spray, a dark feathered pigeon blinks back at him. Her name is Winkie, RAF number N7653. Ross writes a short note in pencil, hands trembling. Forced down, 60 miles east of Aberdeen. 4 alive. He folds the slip, puts it in the message capsule, twists it onto the bird's leg, and lifts her toward the wind. Good girl. Go home. Winkie launches into sleet so heavy it blinds men at 20 yards. She climbs, banks, and vanishes northward, flying through 50-mile-per-hour headwinds, oil clogging her feathers. She doesn't know bearings or coordinates, but she knows one thing perfectly. Home. Her loft is near Aberdeen, at the house of George Ross's unit handler. The flight should take 2 hours in clear weather. Winkie does it in 80 minutes. She crashes through the loft hatch at dusk, half dead, feathers glued with oil, unable to carry another ounce of effort. No message tube remains. The capsule has fallen off during flight, but her mere arrival is message enough. The handler calls RAF Dice immediately. Controllers cross-check time of release, wind direction, estimated fatigue rate for a Pigeon in those conditions, and plot probable drift. They draw a rough circle on a chart. Rescue launches leave harbor 20 minutes later, searchlights cutting through sleet, guided only by a bird's return time and the math of wind. At 10 hours p.m., they find the dinghy. All 4 men alive. The RAF issues a formal statement a week later. Owing to the arrival of the Pigeon Winkie, the crew of Beaufort WWII were rescued after ditching in the North Sea. The bird is awarded the Dickon Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. The citation is simple. For delivering a message under exceptional difficulties and so contributing to the rescue of an aircrew while serving with the RAF in February 1942. Winkie becomes a symbol of a strange kind of reliability, the sort made of instinct, not circuits. The same year, a British intelligence report on radio jamming concludes grimly. Enemy countermeasures render shortwave distress signals unreliable beyond 30 miles. Translation: if your plane goes down, the wireless won't save you, but a Pigeon might. From that point on, RAF Coastal Command standardizes Pigeon carriage for all overwater flights. Each aircraft is issued 2 birds, 1 primary, 1 reserve, trained specifically to home from northern or western sea sectors. Crews are drilled to launch them in sequence. First bird immediately after ditching. Second bird 1 hour later in case of drift or failure. It works again and again, not just in the North Sea, but over the Channel, the Bay of Biscay, and the Adriatic. By 1943, Allied Pigeons have carried more than 10,000 operational messages. Hundreds of those flights lead to confirmed rescues of downed airmen, stranded commandos, and isolated resistance cells. In an age of radar and encrypted telegraphy, the most dependable messenger remains a creature with no engine, no battery, and no language but direction. The British learned to refine it further. Handlers condition their birds to ignore battlefield noise. They simulate flak bursts near the loft, expose them to engine roars, even flash magnesium flares to desensitize them to light shock. The goal isn't compassion, it's survival of the message. A Pigeon can't be frightened into breaking formation, if it's never known quiet. When the time comes to fly through chaos, it simply does what it's done every day since hatching. Finds home through smell, magnetic sense, and memory. What makes Winkie's story remarkable isn't that she flew through a storm. It's that her behavior became a model for an entire system. Biological courier networks more resilient than any radio link of the era. When everything else failed, engines, antennas, batteries, maps, something small, feathered, and uncomplaining did not. And in February 1942, over the North Sea, that was the difference between 4 corpses and 4 men watching a rescue boat's light cut through the fog. September 1944, Holland. Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne drop in history, has turned into a knife fight across rivers, hedgerows, and ruined towns. Radios are failing everywhere. German jammers are working overtime, cutting off the paratroopers and glider troops from their commanders. Static hisses in every headset. Batteries die in the cold. Antenna masts are shattered by mortar fire. In the chaos around Oosterbeek, west of Arnhem, roughly 10,000 British paratroopers and glider troops of the 1st Airborne Division are surrounded. They were supposed to hold the north end of the Arnhem Bridge for 2 days. It's now day 5. Ammunition's low. Medical supplies are gone. The wounded are being treated in basements by candlelight. German armor prowls the streets. Panthers from the 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen. Every radio call for help is swallowed in silence. Somewhere in that chaos, inside a shattered farmhouse that's become a temporary command post, Major Dennis Hewitt pulls a small wicker cage out of a supply crate. Inside, preened and alert despite the thunder outside, sits a pigeon, William of Orange, NPS, 439451, trained by the British Army Pigeon Service and dropped into the Netherlands weeks earlier with the airborne units. He's one of a dozen birds brought in case the wireless sets fail. They've failed. A message is written quickly on a slip of paper. No contact, Div HQ. Surrounded at Oosterbeek. Heavy enemy armor. Casualties high. Need artillery and smoke cover for withdrawal across river. Urgent. The note is rolled, placed in the aluminum message tube, and clipped to William's leg. Hewitt hesitates a second. Wind, gunfire, the odds of survival almost nil. Then he opens the cage. The pigeon bursts into the gray daylight, wings cutting between tracer lines and smoke columns. Soldiers in foxholes watch him vanish westward over the Rhine, a flicker of life heading toward home. The flight to his loft in England is 250 miles, most of it over hostile airspace. German troops spot him near Utrecht and take shots. A Bf-109 pilot, later interviewed after the war, remembered seeing a small bird crossing through anti-aircraft bursts and machine gun fire. Madness. But the madness works. William clears the coast, catches the tailwind, and keeps going. 4 hours and 25 minutes later, he slams into his loft at Lyon-Solent, half his feathers burned from flak, but alive. The message is intact. Handlers at the loft rush the note to Combined Operations HQ. Within minutes, artillery units along the south bank of the Rhine are adjusting their fire. By dusk, smoke screens cover the river crossings, and boats are moving under the haze to pull trapped airborne troops out of the Oosterbeek pocket. Roughly 2,000 men are saved that night, many because a single pigeon crossed a continent faster than any encrypted signal could get through enemy jamming. The official record of the Royal Pigeon Service notes the mission simply: for delivering a message from the Arnhem area in the best possible conditions of wind and weather, but over enemy territory, thereby aiding in the relief of the British airborne forces. He's awarded the Dickon Medal, the highest animal honor in British service. The citation reads, "For delivering a message from the Arnhem area, resulting in the relief of the British troops at Oosterbeek during the Battle of Arnhem, September 1944. To the soldiers who survived, it was simpler. They said the bird carried a brigade on its wings. The German jamming units that caused the crisis were highly effective: shortwave suppression, frequency hopping, deceptive traffic mimicking Allied call signs. It was a perfect example of the limits of technology. British signals officers had the best radios they could build, but when spectrum became noise, a bird could still fly through it. No encryption, no countermeasure, no static. Just direction. By late 1944, pigeons were no longer a novelty. They were an integrated element of the British and American communications network. RAF Bomber Command maintained lofts at every major airfield. The U.S. Army Signal Corps managed over 50,000 birds across Europe and North Africa. Pigeon sections existed alongside radar and cipher units, their cages stacked beside antennas and switchboards. At Arnhem, in the chaos of Market Garden, that system proved irreplaceable. It wasn't glamorous, but it was fast, silent, and incorruptible. William of Orange had done what radios, wires, and encryption couldn't: bridge the gap between men dying in the dark and those who could save them. By war's end, analysts estimated that Allied pigeons had carried more than 150,000 operational messages with success rates above 95%. No other communication system of the war, human or mechanical, could match that reliability. The simplest tool in the sky had become the most dependable. William of Orange was retired after Arnhem, his cage lined with medals and his story printed in dispatches. For the rest of his life, when handlers opened his loft door, he always looked east, toward the Rhine. Toward the place where 1,000 men watched him disappear into smoke and believed, against all reason, that help might still come. Spring 1945. The war is finally tilting toward its end, but the fighting is still savage. Across Europe, the front is a blur of craters, broken cities, and static. Radios are everywhere now: backpacks, jeeps, half-tracks. But reliability hasn't improved much. Static still kills messages. German counterintelligence still listens. And on the fringes of the war, in occupied France, the Low Countries, Norway, the pigeons are still flying, carrying messages that no cable or frequency can safely deliver. One of those birds is Mary of Exeter. She's small, gray, ordinary-looking. Her handler is a shoemaker named Charlie Brewer from Exeter, a volunteer with the National Pigeon Service. In 1940, Mary was just another racing pigeon. By 1942, she's flying for the British Secret Service, crossing the Channel in the dark, carrying rolled-up microfilm from the French resistance. Mary's first runs are rough. She's released near Rennes with instructions to reach her loft in Devon, 280 miles away. German anti-aircraft gunners are trained to shoot birds now. The Luftwaffe knows the Allies are using them. On her third flight, a falcon released by the Germans claws her mid-air, tears her neck, and she still makes it home. Bloodied, feathers torn, but alive. Brewer stitches the wound himself with black thread and swears under his breath that she'll never fly again. 3 weeks later, she's back in the air. She keeps flying, through fog, flak, and predators. One flight ends with a shattered wing, another with a bullet lodged in her breastbone. Each time, Brewer patches her up, feeds her warm grain, and she returns to duty. The French resistance changes her routes constantly. Rouen 1 month, Caen the next, sometimes dropped by agents in the countryside with a tiny bundle of negatives showing rail lines, panzer convoys, or new bunker complexes. Each run is life or death. Capture means execution for anyone connected to her handler. Failure means another Allied bombing raid goes blind. By 1944, Mary of Exeter has flown more than a dozen covert missions. Her name becomes whispered currency in intelligence circles. At Bletchley Park, intercept analysts read resistance reports that begin per Mary, shorthand for arrived by pigeon. The photographs she carries of German coastal defenses near Cherbourg are used in planning the D-Day naval bombardment. She isn't decoration. She's logistics. Her handler calls her the soldier with feathers. The British press later calls her the bird that wouldn't die. She receives the Dickon Medal in 1945 for outstanding endurance and bravery on war service, but even that citation understates it. Her record includes 3 injuries, 14 cross-channel flights, and the delivery of over a dozen microfilm reels, each one potentially saving hundreds of men. It wasn't just Mary. By the war's last year, Allied Pigeons were operating out of Italy, Greece, and Yugoslavia. Resistance networks in the Balkans used them to coordinate with British SOE missions. The animals carried everything from full-page reports to microscopic dots of film hidden under their leg bands. The advantage was absolute silence. A radio call, even in cipher, could be detected. A bird was invisible to signals intelligence. German countermeasures became desperate. They deployed hawks around major communication hubs and even built flak towers fitted with fine mesh to stop pigeons from crossing into occupied territory. It helped a little, maybe. But the birds kept coming. The Germans could control the air with radar and fighters, but not the sky that belonged to instincts older than war. Pigeons served on the front lines, too. Infantry battalions in Italy and the Western Front used them to relay coordinates when radio batteries failed or shells cut wire. During the fighting along the Garigliano River in early 1944, British units used pigeons to correct artillery fire when their forward observers lost line of sight. Messages like, "Increase fire 200 yards north," or "Ceasefire," "Own troops advancing," arrived minutes faster than runners could move, and without the risk of a line getting cut by shell fire. In total, more than 250,000 pigeons served with Allied forces in the Second World War. 32 received the Dickon Medal for heroism, carrying messages under fire, returning through smoke, and sometimes landing on the roof of a field HQ just as the shelling stopped. Not one of them could be replaced by any machine the Allies had in 1945. The post-war statistics are almost absurd in their simplicity. 95% message delivery success rate. Average flight speed, 50 miles per hour. Average operational range, 60 to 200 miles, depending on wind. No radio, no code, no wire ever matched that combination of speed, reliability, and silence. To soldiers in the field, it wasn't a statistic. It was the sound of wings overhead when every other connection was dead. A pilot downed in the channel, a platoon cut off behind a river, a spy hiding in a cellar in Rouen, all could trust the same thing: that a bird with a scrap of paper on its leg would fly through the dark and find home. Mary of Exeter survived the war. Brewer kept her in the loft behind his shop until she died in 1950. He buried her in his garden with her medal nailed to a small wooden cross. She had carried intelligence that guided bombers, saved civilians, and shortened a war. She had done it without speech, without calculation, without hesitation. By the time she died, radar had evolved, jet engines roared over Europe, and early computers were decoding signals in seconds. But in the memory of every pilot, partisan, and signalman who lived because of her kind, one truth remained: when all else failed, the bird got through. October 1943, southern Italy. The British 56th London Division has just taken Calvi Vecchia, a small village outside Calvi Risorta, after 3 days of vicious fighting. The Germans are retreating north under pressure from the 8th Army, leaving behind mines, snipers, and wreckage. The British infantrymen are exhausted, but alive. Their radio operators aren't so lucky. Most of the wireless sets were destroyed by shell fire. The few that remain have burned out tubes or shredded antennas. In the command post of the 169th Infantry Brigade, Captain Richard Simmons studies the map with growing dread. His orders are to signal the U.S. Tourdunes Air Support Command that the village is secure. But the message won't go through. And the Americans, who don't know the British have reached the objective, are already prepping to bomb Calvi Vecchia in 1 hour. The target coordinates haven't been updated. If the airstrike goes ahead, it'll obliterate the British positions and kill more than 1,000 of their own men. The only backup is sitting in a wicker cage at Simmons's feet. A pigeon named G.I. Joe, service number USA 43SC639, belonging to the U.S. Army Signal Corps. He's a small slate-gray cockbird, hatched in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, trained at the Army's Pigeon School in Algiers, and assigned to the British Division for liaison flights. He's been waiting for weeks in that cage for exactly this moment, when every other line of communication fails. Simmons scribbles a message in pencil. Calvi Vecchia captured by 56th Divisions. Hold airstrike. Troops in village. He rolls the slip of paper into the aluminum message capsule, fastens it to Joe's leg, and steps outside into the Italian sun. The air smells of smoke and cordite. He lifts the cage door. Joe flutters once, blinks, and launches. The distance to the American airfield at Kollerdgauff's headquarters near Caserta is about 20 miles. Joe flies it in just 20 minutes. The air is thick with smoke, artillery echoes, and mountain winds, but he flies straight, unwavering, like a bullet. At Caserta, the U.S. air crews are already climbing into their Mitchell bombers. Ground crews are warming engines. A red flare signals, "Ready for takeoff." Then someone spots the Pigeon diving toward the operations tent. Sergeant Harry Schofield catches him by instinct. The bird's feathers are caked with dust, his chest heaving. But the message is still there. Schofield yanks out the note, reads it once, and shouts for the operations officer. "Stop the mission! Stop the bloody mission!" Runners tear across the tarmac, waving red flags. The bombers throttle down, one by one. The message reaches the control tent with 3 minutes to spare. 3 minutes. If Joe had been delayed by even a single gust of wind, the first wave of B-25s would have been airborne, their bomb racks loaded for a target now filled with Allied soldiers. Instead, the order is cancelled, and 1,000 men in Calvi Vecchia live. Afterward, U.S. Air Support Command logs the event as routine message delivery, but word spreads through the ranks. The British 56th Division calls him the Yank bird that saved the Londoners. The Americans shorten it to G.I. Joe. In November 1943, General Mark Clark personally inspects the division and hears the story from Simmons himself. He orders Joe sent back to headquarters for special commendation. When the war ends, G.I. Joe is awarded the Dickin Medal, the highest honor an animal can receive, for the most outstanding flight by a United States Army pigeon in World War II. The citation notes, "Delivered a message to stop a bombing raid, just in time to save the lives of more than 1,000 Allied soldiers. He becomes a living mascot of the Allied Signal Corps, photographed perched on a soldier's shoulder beside rows of antennas. But his legacy runs deeper than the headlines. His flight demonstrates something the Allies never forgot. Even in an age of telegraph, code, and radar, the simplest messenger, alive, silent, and loyal, could outperform all of it." Historians later calculate that Joe flew through airspace filled with active anti-aircraft guns, dodging ground fire and debris from burning villages. The odds of a pigeon surviving that route were less than 1 in 10. But Joe's instinct, honed through thousands of generations of navigation and training that relied on magnetic fields, sun angles, and scent patterns, made him almost infallible. The Army Signal Corps kept using pigeons through the end of the war. They flew from Normandy beaches, from jungle bases in Burma, even from submarines that carried collapsible lofts on deck. When radios failed under tropical humidity, or German listening posts triangulated a call, commanders turned to the birds, silent couriers that couldn't be jammed, hacked, or decoded. By 1945, the Allies had over 200,000 trained pigeons in service. Many never returned. Some were lost to hawks, others to exhaustion or weather. but tens of thousands made their flights, often across active battlefronts, carrying notes that meant life or death for soldiers on the ground. The British Pigeon Service estimated that its birds had saved at least 20,000 Allied troops during the war. After the surrender, the birds who survived were retired to their lofts in Britain, the U.S., and France. Winkie, William of Orange, Mary of Exeter, and G.I. Joe, all retired heroes, became symbols of the quiet courage that technology could never replace. Today, their medals rest in glass cases, G.I. Joe's at the U.S. Army Communications Museum in Fort Monmouth, William of Orange's at the Imperial War Museum, Winkie's in Dundee. Each medal is stamped with the same words, "For gallantry. We also serve." In every war since, pigeons have disappeared from frontline service, replaced by satellites and encrypted transmissions. But the principle remains: technology can fail, courage cannot. In the sky above every battlefield, for 6 long years, small shadows once flew against wind, smoke, and fire, bearing nothing but a scrap of paper and the unshakable certainty of home. One of them, a gray bird from New Jersey, reached that home with 3 minutes to spare, and saved 1,000 men who never knew his name until after the war was won.